Welcome to Buildings and Beyond,
the podcast that explores how we can create a more sustainable built environment
by focusing on efficiency, accessibility, and health.
Hello, I'm Rob Aldrich. In this episode, I talked with my colleague, Gayathri Vijayakumar, an engineer here at Stephen Winter Associates. We talked about a question she's been getting a lot lately, which is what happened with the IECC? There's been a decent amount of press about this, at least in the efficient building world. Gayathri was on the committee that developed the 2024 residential IECC, and she will tell you what happened in some detail. First, I want to run through a few acronyms which don't get explained in the podcast. ICC is the International Code Council. IECC is the International Energy Conservation Code, which is one of the codes published by the ICC. PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab. BOMA, Building Owners and Managers Association. NAHB is the National Association of Home Builders. AHRI is the Air Conditioning, Heating and Refrigeration Institute. I think that's all of them. As you might be able to tell, there are a lot of players in this process. And Gayathri rattled off quite a few acronyms. I just wanted to do a quick run through of what I think most of them mean. This podcast episode is really about the process, not the content of the code. About halfway in, we do get a summary of some of the key changes with the 2024 residential IECC, but we don't dive into the details. This is really about the process of how the code got made, gets made. There's a lot of discussion related to decarbonization and or electrification. That was one of the sticking points in this process. And in this episode, we don't get into the merits or challenges of decarbonization or electrification. We really focus on the process. I'll refer you to another a roundtable podcast episode we recorded in July of 2023. There were several of us, 5, I think, including Gayathri and myself. Answering Tough Questions About Energy Codes was the title. Answering is a little optimistic. We certainly didn't have unanimous objective answers, but we did have really a good discussion. There's also an episode in 2020 that I recorded with Gayathri, How Codes Get Made, which really documented the process for the 2021 IECC, so the last cycle. This episode is not an unbiased account of the process. This is very much Gayathri's perspective, as you will certainly hear. She's been in the thick of it for the last 3 years, nearly 3 years. We talked April 2nd, 2024. So when she references dates, last fall, this coming fall, keep in mind that we talked in spring of 2024. I started by asking for Gayathri for a brief summary of how the IEC used to be developed. We talk about it in a lot more detail in that episode I mentioned, but we start with Gayathri summarizing that process.
Sure. So folks go back to listen to that podcast. The old process to develop the I codes, energy codes, there was a small committee. Anyone could submit a proposal for consideration by this small committee, and it was split by residential.
Anyone, not just in the committee, anyone in the world could write in and send a proposal?
Anyone in the world could say, hey, I don't like this from the 2018 IECC or IRC or whatever I code it was, propose to change it. And so your proposal goes in a book, a monograph with everybody else's, and there are smaller committees that hear that first round of proposals and give it an approval, disapproval, and then you make it to a second hearing. So you've got this thing called a committee action hearing and then a public comment hearing. So the voting process there, you start off with a small committee that gives you your thumbs up or thumbs down. When you come back to the public comment hearing, now you're in a room full of voters. These are governmental voters, and so they give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. And you can modify things and work with other people, but the process, largely dependent on the big block of voters. And then there's a final online vote. So when I got involved in the 2021 ICC for the proposed changes that led to that book, I only had a couple proposals. I was caring about air leakage for multifamily. There's a ERI, an energy rating index option that I wanted available to multifamily that's in the commercial provisions, above 4 stories. So I was only kind of dabbling in energy code development at that point. So at the end of the 2021, this is kind of stuff I've learned after the fact, But at the end of 2021, there was a appeals process. Folks filed appeals based on things that were approved through the online vote, things that they thought were not in the scope or intent of the book.
Sorry, can I stop you? That online vote was just a vote by hundreds or thousands of
these
government
governmental
agencies,
voters. Yeah, it's called OGCV.
building departments.
Yeah, I don't even know what it stands. Online governmental consensus vote. It's government officials, city, building officials, state energy offices, lots of folks that are eligible, but not everyone is eligible, right? So, anyone can submit a public comment or a proposal to be considered, but not everyone can vote. It's a select group of people that are eligible for voting.
Yep. And the voting, as I understand it, the voters who have the last say kind of overrode a lot of the process to go kind of above and beyond to greener, more efficiency, some electrification. And they pushed it further than the regular process did, as I understand it.
Yeah, so at the public comment hearing, so in view of public, there's rounds of votes, right? The committee action hearing, there's a table that tells you this is how it got voted, up or down, approved, disapproved. The public comment hearing is the same kind of group of officials, but it's in person. So people that are present to hear the testimony on these code changes, they get to vote. It's the same kind of type of, governmental official that's voting. So all these results get, reported to everyone. So everyone sees that these proposals, and a proposal like mine had passed. Everyone saw that it passed, in the public comment hearing. It again passed in the online voting at the very end. No surprises there. But to your point, there were some proposals that had failed at that public comment round and were reported as having been disapproved. When I say fail, that means disapproved by the voters. And it got flipped. And so that was during the online Get Out the Vote campaign. A lot of government officials got on there and did vote in favor of some of those proposals that had failed in the public comment round. And so some of those were passing now.
Gotcha.
And so the appeals were filed on two kind of grounds. One was that online Get Out the Vote campaign. Was that part of the process? Was it intended that votes could be flipped in this online voting system at the very end? And that was deemed to be procedurally fine. That was not an issue. There was no violation in process by having this Get Out the Vote campaign and flipping votes. The other appeal that was sustained was based on scope and intent. And this is going to be important in the end of this podcast because we're going to revisit this topic. But at the end of 2021, there was at least two proposals that had failed at public comment hearing, right? In plain sight of everyone, had failed because of the online vote, had been approved. And so we're destined to be printed in the 2021 IECC. Appeals were filed saying, hey, electric vehicle charging, electric readiness for stoves and water heaters, these things are not in the scope and intent of the Energy Code, and therefore they represent procedural violations, and so we're appealing these. And so, and by we, I mean, it wasn't me, that was an appeal filed by the National Association of Home Builders. And so they filed those appeals, and the ICC has a system of, processing appeals. They had an appeals board that heard the arguments, and they agreed. They agreed that while these were voted by the online governmental voters that took the time to vote, they agreed that these proposals were actually not within the scope and intent as written in the Energy Code. And so electric vehicle charging and this electric readiness was actually removed post-voting for the 2021. So that's why you don't see those in the 2021 IECC.
All right. So those two things got nixed.
Yes.
EV charging readiness.
Yep.
And electric water heater.
Electric readiness for gas stoves, dryers, water heating.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So two things got nixed from the 2021 code, moving towards the electrification side of things. And then after this groundswell of voters kind of overturned a lot of what the main code development process established, ICC decided that the procedure needed to be changed, is my understanding.
That's also my understanding. So they put it out for public comment. How do we change this process? There's a lot of disappointment, frustration with the previous process. So they did put this out for public comment. Should we change the process to having the code be developed under a standards development process. And so codes and standards are different words. An energy code is this book we're talking about, the IECC, but standards are kind of like ASHRAE or ANSI standards. They're developed in a slightly different process. They have consensus committees that meet and discuss and debate these code change proposals. It's not the same as this code hearing process that we've been used to, and it's still actually used for the other I codes like IRC, IMC. Those books are still developed in that old process. It was just this IECC, the energy code, that they decided, let's consider a different development process. And so they said, we were going to develop like a standard. So they were going to establish a consensus committee. So they put out a call for applications for folks to apply to be part of the residential consensus committee or the commercial consensus committee. And each of those two committees would be charged with hearing the proposals that are submitted, again, submitted by anybody. So that part is still similar to the old code process where anybody can submit a public comment. But instead of it going through those rounds that we talked about before, the committee is a larger group of people. It's 48 members. It's a balanced and diverse group of people. And that's kind of like the mandate in standards development process. If you create a standards committee, it has to be balanced and diverse. And so in the 48, they designated that at least a minimum of 16 voters would have to be government officials. I think they recognized in the past process, the government officials were the ones that got to vote. So they wanted to give them a large block in that voting membership. And this is important because any proposal that needs to pass to get into the book has to achieve a 2/3 consensus vote, right? So if you have 48 people, you have to have 32 people approve something, right? But 16 people could possibly prevent it from going forward. So the point was, you need to get consensus. There's no way to do this without building consensus. And so then the rest of the makeup of the committee, I'm a voting member. So there was other designers, architects. It's a giant alphabet soup, right? You had New Buildings Institute, ACEEE, DOE, NHB. We have a builder organization. We have multiple builders. We had Leading Builders America had a seat. Individual builders like Beazer Homes, American Gas Association. We had an electric utility represented. So broad, diverse stakeholders, in theory.
Manufacturers,
right? We had AHRI on there. We had the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition on there. So the theory behind this is, what if we get a bunch of people on one committee to hear these proposals and they represent diverse perspectives? And if we can get those folks to agree, wouldn't that be a better process? So I think in theory, it would have worked out. Except we'll get to the end and find out. Some foreshadowing.
And it's understandable because the kind of the groundswell of voting members in the last code cycle overriding a decent amount of the big, long, hairy process. It's like, well, God, why do we have this big, long, hairy process if it just gets changed in the end by the voters? So I can understand the desire to do something a little more streamlined or direct, maybe. The other question I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned this before, scope and intent. Can we tee up the scope and intent at this point? What is the scope and intent of the ICC, of ICC codes overall, of the organization overall?
I think I think we should probably copy it into the show notes later, but I'll paraphrase at least a little bit. Because in the 2021 ICC, it was determined that it was basically supposed to be limited to energy conservation. So the arguments made by the appellants was that electric vehicle charging or readiness isn't really conserving energy. And, electric readiness for your gas water heater or dryer, whatever, is not really saving energy in itself for the building at that moment in time. And so the appellants argue that this is not in the scope or intent. So at the beginning of the I codes or even the IRC, you'll see a scope and intent section, which says, the scope, this applies to whatever type of building. And the intent is what is the intent of this code? So that was the argument, and that's what the board of directors agreed. No, you're right.
So we're talking about 2021 still.
Back in 2021. That they said, okay, this is not part of the scope and intent. I think the frustration there was that scope and intent had been listed like that for 3 years. So I think people felt frustrated that intent statement was there all along. When these code change proposals were being heard, either by the small committee that heard it first or the public comment action hearing, at no time there was it just dismissed entirely. Like, why weren't they just removed completely? Hey, this is a proposal that's not even in the intent or scope of this book. It should not even be heard. But it was given airtime. So I think it gives people this false sense of, this can be heard. People can't just submit random proposals. You can't just submit something for high performance fire engines in the energy code. That would be dismissed. It wouldn't even be heard, right? So I think that kind of gives people this false sense of, oh, I can do this. It was brought to the floor. It was heard. So the scope and intent as part of this new process after 2021 and the ICC deciding, let's try this as a standards development process. Maybe that'll be more transparent, more streamlined. We'll have a chance to build better consensus. When they did that, they also took the time to rewrite the intent statement. So like I said, the intent statement, and we'll put it in the show notes, was very short. This one is
of the IECC
of
itself.
the IECC, the energy code. And it's very similar in the residential provisions and the commercial. And so it's much longer. I think it was like 2 or 3 sentences before, and now it's a gigantic paragraph. And so in there, they talk about the Energy Carbon Council that has been formed, and they talk about greenhouse gas emissions, and they talk about a lot more things that were never mentioned before. And so it's kind of this rinse and repeat situation. We convened this committee. This is back in October of 2021. So less than 3 years ago.
The Residential Consensus Committee.
The Residential Consensus Committee, which I participate in. The Commercial Consensus Committee is also being convened at the same time. And so, the call for proposals goes out. I know our group got about 200 proposals. And so as we're hearing these proposals, they're being funneled to us and saying, this committee gets this. We have an envelope and embodied carbon subcommittee. We have a modeling subcommittee. We've got a committee for HVAC and hot water. So these proposals are being funneled and filtered to the right committees, subcommittees. And so we start hearing these proposals. And we're hearing proposals that are for electric vehicle readiness and electric readiness and complete electrification of the code. We're hearing new proposals that some people are saying, hey, this is also outside the scope and intent of the IECC. Even though the board of directors had completely revised it, lengthened it, you would think with the intention to avoid what happened in 2021. Like, why repeat what happened in 2021 when you get to the end of a process and appeals are made because it wasn't clear from the beginning which proposals could be considered in the code and which ones couldn't be.
So there was somebody between the people, again, whoever wanted to can submit a proposal. That gets filtered and directed by, before it gets to you, somebody else at ICC. Between
ICC staff or another subcommittee, there was some kind of filtering process, or maybe that's what we assumed, there was some filtering process. We were told things that were outside the scope would not be, passed on. Again, my example of the fire engine, right? I think things that are completely out of scope would clearly be like, oh, you're in the wrong book, right? I think that was our understanding. But since we were getting these, that kind of reinforced the idea that why would we send our consensus committee proposals that are deemed outside of scope or intent? We just learned the hard way that this causes problems at the end if we're not clear about scope and intent from the beginning. Let's not repeat that mistake. Let's make sure it's very, very clear. And so what happened as we started voting on those 200 some proposals, and we're seeing all these measures that are very greenhouse gas related, very similar to the 2 that had been yanked out at the end of the 2021, we're asking questions. There's 48 members. We all have different interpretations of what we're reading in the intent statement. A large group thinks, hey, it talks about greenhouse gases, greenhouse gas emissions. Clearly, they intended for us to do a better job than last time. Clearly, they changed the intent so we would know that this is part of the Energy Conservation Code, that this is something we do want to do. We do want to help our communities confront climate change. And there's lots of words and language on their website that implies that the ICC wants to be in a leadership position, helping communities adopt the model code, and it is their path forward to confronting climate change. So you have all this language on their website and in these documents, and it implies that this is the direction we're going. So a lot of us read it that way. And then a lot of other people say, no, that's not how you read the code. You can only read the 5 sentences in this book, and you read them in this exact order, and this is what it means. And so instead of debating it back and forth between us, we thought, let's ask the board of directors who wrote it, can they interpret it for us? Can they say clearly, definitively, can EV charging go in the main body? Does it go in appendix? Does it go nowhere?
And that's another distinction of can provisions like that be included in the main body versus an appendix?
Exactly.
That was another question.
That's going to be the core of what, again, more foreshadowing. We're building up to this. But yeah, so we asked the board of directors, before, we all want to learn from our mistakes, right? We don't want a repeat of 2021 IECC. That'd be silly, right? Why repeat what we just did? So we asked them for clear guidance. You guys wrote the intent statement. What did you mean by this sentence, right? When you say, appendices can include, I want to put this in the show notes because I don't want to paraphrase it and get it wrong. But there was language in there about greenhouse gas emissions, which led people to believe that it could be in the main body and not just in an appendix. Because it says it may be included in the appendix, but it never prohibited it from being in the main body of the code. So a lot of us thought, well, in the absence of a sentence that explicitly prohibits it from being in the main body, it can be. So we asked the board of directors. We got a memo back in February of 2022. We haven't, really taken action on many proposals at this point. We get a memo back saying that they're not going to weigh in on this topic during the process of development. So we have no guidance from them. So in a memo, we get guidance from ICC staff that says the Code Council provides the following direction. Any content within the scope and intent of the code may be included either in the body of the code as minimum requirements or as an adoptable appendix based on the determination of the responsible consensus committee. So again, we asked the board of directors who wrote it for clear guidance. Clearly interpret this for us. We don't want to make decisions based on our own interpretations, which there's varying interpretation within the committee. We don't want to make this decision ourselves. Give us guidance. And this same document says, the board has not previously provided updates or clarification to the scope or intent of codes or standards during an active development process, allowing the development process to proceed to resolution. So they want to pass the buck to the end. ICC staff knows that we're struggling. We can't take action if we have to wait till the end. We need to know this now. If at any point they wanted to clarify that, no, that's a false statement, it is not up to the responsible consensus committees to make this decision, they had that opportunity back in February of 2022, almost 2 years ago. And I think that's where the frustration is as we get to the end of, what happened in 2024.
So you're frustrated. God,
I am
wasn't
frustrated.
Coming through at all.
I love repeating mistakes.
Okay. So let's defer how things ended up until a little bit later. But can you give us a little bit of feel for how the consensus committee worked, what the process was?
Sure. So all the proponents, right? You have these subcommittees, you got proponents submitting their proposals, they get filtered to the little subcommittees. And again, the vote is of the subcommittee. So the subcommittee decides, hey, this should go forward, it should be modified, it should be disapproved. So the subcommittee is kind of the first pass. And it's very, content focused, envelope or mechanical systems, things like that. Then it goes up to the larger 48-member committee. And so the 48 members all were given the opportunity to each sit on a subcommittee, but only one subcommittee, right? So maybe you heard on a proposal, if you're on envelope subcommittee, you heard it and you heard all the testimony for and against it. You're really in the weeds of it. And then it gets up to the main committee and then you're going to hear it again, right? But it comes with a recommendation. So this is all, if anyone listening is participating in standards committee, we follow Robert's rules of procedures. So there's motions. So it comes with a motion. The subcommittee recommends that, it be approved or be disapproved or modified or tabled, something comes up. And so if that 48-member committee, agrees with the subcommittee, it moves on to the next step. Now, early in this process, they were allowing proposals to pass with a simple majority, which only meant half of us had to approve something. So proposals based on this memo, proposals for EV charging and electric readiness, these things were passing with a simple majority because at least half of the members on the call that day, again, it went to all 48 people weren't ever present at that time. So you get, 18 to 20 folks supporting something, they would pass. So tons of things were being proposed and passing at that point.
Interesting. Okay.
What we weren't expecting or we didn't know because it was a brand new process, right? So all these things are being proposed at a simple majority rate. And at the end, this is in June of 2022 or so, we have about 100 of the 200 proposals have been approved, either approved with some modifications. So the subcommittees could say to the proponent, hey, table this, do X, Y, Z, bring it back. I think, there's something there that we can support, but it's not written in code language and it needs a little work. There's lots of opportunity. So again, I think in theory this works because there was lots of opportunity to be like, hey, go take that back and bring it back. Except it was very time consuming. So this process ideally has some good qualities to it, but it was very time consuming. But anyways, we get back, we've heard all these proposals. We've got 100 that have, passed simple majority on their own. And now we're back at this point where actually they're gonna take all the proposals together and ask the members, now we need 2/3 of you to say, when it's all combined in our first draft, we're about to send this out to public comment. We took all 100, we've drafted the book. Do you agree with this going out to public comment? Can I get 2/3 of you to say yes? Wow. And you couldn't. You couldn't because there was at least a dozen proposals that only hit the simple majority, achievement rate. So now we're at this point where it's like, well, do those all just go away, right? So we are in public comment meetings, right? Not public comment meetings, but meetings that are open to the public. So the public who's participating, all these meetings are open to the public. I guess I should have started that. So these consensus meetings, these subcommittee meetings, it's all open to the public. So we're hearing, the debates for and against from all stakeholders. People who don't want EV charging in the code, we're hearing from them. People who do want it in the code, we're hearing from them. Based on that testimony, people are voting how they want to vote, right? And so at the very end, what do we do with all these proposals? And because we had this clear guidance from the council, I took it upon myself to say, what if we keep this group of proposals that has cleared a simple majority? These are kind of like the hot topics. These are the hot buttons. It's electric readiness, EV readiness, solar readiness. Folks wanted on the other end, they wanted tighter air leakage, lots of things. And so worked out, when we do our ballots, so we vote and we had to say, if we're not going to vote for something, we actually have to write down why.
So there are 5 or 10 sticking points that kept the code. Okay.
Yeah. And so we have to, respond. How could you be resolved? You can't just complain and say, I don't like it, take it out, right? So the point is you're supposed to resolve your own objection. What don't you like about it? Is there something you could edit in this current proposal that could get your support? So 48 people doing that is not, it's unwieldy, right? And so I thought, instead of 48 people submitting, their various changes, why don't we meet and decide what are the various changes, how many people could support this one or that one in order to get these 16 to go together. And so that process happened. And again, it was under this understanding that we had clear guidance from that memo that I just read that, anything can go in the main body or an appendix as determined by the committee. And so those proposals, EV readiness, solar readiness, all those proposals had gone through. And so even a year later, those are still in, we go through the public comment round a couple times, right? So we put this book out for public comment. Hey, everyone, these are the proposals that your consensus committee have agreed to put in the first draft of the 2024 IECC. What do you think? And this was just 100 proposals. The feedback on that draft was 400 new proposals. Because now they can comment on the things that we've added and things that weren't even touched before. So it was like starting the whole process over. So we whittle through all those proposals. Again, a lot of them were duplicates. A lot of people, proposing to take things out that we had just added, right? So go through that a couple more rounds. And then, so last summer was the last round of this. Last summer, the book went out. Again, now it's just kind of fine tuning. I think at that point, we only got maybe 50 to 60 proposals back, right? Because now we're really kind of trimming down what is open for public comment. So certain aspects that have been voted on and approved, eventually they become off the table in the standards development process. You can no longer comment on that. It's been voted. Now it's only new language that you can vote on. So we get to that point, right? And so that was around, let's say, the fall of last year, September of last year, where this book, in our opinion, is done. As a consensus committee, we feel like this is now done.
You've mentioned a few times things like EV charging and our readiness and electric appliance readiness. Can you maybe go through some of those sticking points and flush them out in a little more detail so people will know? So EV readiness, for example, what was that about? I mean, the concept people will know.
I mean, it was actually very similar to the proposal that got pulled from the 2021 IECC. So it wasn't a mandate to do electric charging, right? Electric vehicle charging. You don't have to install the actual charger. There was kind of levels to the readiness. Like, can you provide a conduit? Can you provide, a breaker that is labeled? Things like that. It was just readiness. So there was tiers. So if somebody who wanted to provide a full charger, they could. For the appliances, like the water heater. So the point was not to prohibit gas, right? So if you're installing a gas water heater, installing a gas dryer, gas stove, that's all fine. That's not prohibited. We're just saying, can we, enable future homeowners to make the switch to electric? Can you provide an outlet that's sufficient for that switch? So that's kind of the electric readiness. The solar readiness, actually, the solar readiness provisions were already an appendix in the 2021 IECC. So it was already an appendix. That language was just brought from the appendix to the main body of the code.
Gotcha.
And that's just, roof area and conduit. Very, very simple readiness things.
And so all of these three things were in the main body of the code. You have to be able to install an electric. You have to wire the house to be able to install an electric range sometime in the future, even if you install gas.
Yep.
When it's new. And the same for water heating, and the same for EVs. Those are all in the main body of the code.
That's what the consensus committee voted on.
Gotcha.
And kept voting to approve over the last 2 years.
Okay. How about other big changes between 2021 and 2024?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep. So besides that, so those are kind of mandatory provisions. Some big overhauls to how you do energy modeling. So, a lot of folks talk about the prescriptive code, but there's also two modeling paths. So there's a simulated performance path and the ERI path, that energy rating index path. A lot of folks know from, if they do Energy Star or Zero Energy Ready Homes. So you have two other compliance paths. So those got updated quite a bit.
Okay.
The prescriptive path does see a big overhaul. So folks who haven't seen the 2021 energy code, a big change there was this additional efficiency package that was added to the prescriptive path, because in the 2018, you went through, you had prescriptive requirements for envelope and some stuff related to HVAC equipment, but it's mostly insulation, right? And so they added a section called additional energy efficiency. And so after you did all these mandatory requirements, you had to pick one of these options. And one of the options was enhanced envelope. Can you go beyond the base requirement for insulation? Okay, that's one package. Can you do advanced water heating, right? Tankless water heater, heat pump water heater. That could be one of your packages. Or high performance HVAC, ERV. So they had like 5 categories and you just had to pick one. So anybody who's entering into the 2021 ICC, a state that's recently adopted it, that's going to be kind of fundamentally new compared to 2018. So in 2024, that gets rewritten to follow a point structure that the commercial code had been using. And so rather than just having these 5 preset kind of inflexible packages, right? So it's kind of binary, right? It's like the ground source heat pump in the HVAC section is just this minimum efficiency level. If you didn't meet it, there weren't other options. Same with, the water heater. So there wasn't a lot of range there. So it switches to a point system. So that's going to be, I think, the big change in 2024. And that was well supported across this consensus committee, right? So that was something that everybody wanted. Everybody liked the flexibility. Everybody knew that, the more measures we have in here, the more opportunity for savings. We need to get this code, for many of us, we thought we were trying to get this code to 0. And so the more measures we put in there that builders can choose from, builders need the options, the flexibility. So I think that table is going to be great.
Cool. Yeah. So that was, I heard a lot of grumbling about that. For people that follow the prescriptive path, you have to do this minimum level and then you have to do more. It's like, oh, well, and it was very frustrating. Yeah. And now you still have to do more, but there's a much bigger menu of more items that you can select from. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. So there, even in the HVAC section alone, there's like 14 different options, between a combination of furnace and air conditioner, cold climate heat pumps, appliances, there's tons and tons of stuff. And you're picking 2 of them and they have to add up to a certain number of points. And those points equate to savings. And it's nice, simple, PNL does the energy modeling behind them to decide like what the point values are. and it's by climate zone. So you can pick a measure that might have a few points in your climate zone and it might have different points in a different climate zone. But PNNL does all the numbers behind it. And I think the theory there is 10 points is set to achieve a certain amount of savings. So their preliminary analysis, 3 years ago, based on our first round of this 2024 IECC, was that this is going to save 6 to 7% site energy cost savings over the 2021. And 2021 was largely held as a very big jump in efficiency.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's going to be a lot of good things.
But more versatility also, which everybody likes.
Yeah.
And there was big homes needed to do more, if I recall?
Yes. Yep. So there'll be, in all the 3 paths, that prescriptive one with the points, you'll have to get more points if you are above 5,000 square feet. And then in that modeling path, the ERI kind of already takes into consideration, the size of the home. The ERI energy rating index floats with that. But in the simulated performance path, that's the other modeling path, there is an additional, percent savings you must achieve over the code-based home.
One thing you haven't mentioned, I don't think, but you've mentioned it to me before, was the all-electric appendix.
Yes.
Is that worth talking about now?
Sure. So that was a proposal initially that had been for the main body of the code, and the committee heard that, and it was voted down quickly.
This was a proposal that came in from
I don't remember
beginning.
who. I don't remember who.
Yeah.
But this is part of that topic, that led us to ask the board of directors for clear guidance on what could be in the main body of the code. And so because we were, again, told it was up to us, we heard this, and this did not achieve consensus. Folks did not, we did not have enough support to get the all-electric requirement into the main body. So the proponent actually made it an appendix right away.
And what is it? You talk about it. What does it consist of?
It's a very simple sentence that just says, all these appendices, if I haven't mentioned before, are just optional things that a jurisdiction can add when they adopt the I code and amend the main body with this. It's basically just an overlay. It's code language. It's written in code language. If a jurisdiction wants to adopt it, they can replace main body, sections with it, or it's an overlay. So all it was it adds a sentence that says, in the chapter 4, when it talks about the residential buildings that are subject, or the provisions apply to residential buildings, it says they must be all electric, and that's it. And so then there's a bunch of definitions that come along with that, because what do you mean by all electric?
Okay.
So there's a bunch of definitions, but in essence, has to be all electric for heating, all electric for water heating. And so again, when that came in, the original format was in the main body of the code, and that was not well supported. There was not, I think maybe it didn't even get simple majority. And so that went to an appendix. The proponent pivoted and said, I'll take that feedback, made an appendix. And so that was going to be in an appendix. And I think we're quickly getting to the end of the podcast where we reveal what actually happened.
Okay. So we've run through, there's some good things. There's some more versatility to get more savings. There's EV readiness in the main body of the code. There's some changes to air tightness, a little bit more airtight if you follow a prescriptive path. At long last, and I know I walked by your office and you were on calls seemingly most of the day, every day, for a couple of years almost. Yep. It seems like getting this done. You reached consensus, and then what happens? Or what happened?
Yeah. So in the fall, right, like I said, we thought this was the book. We thought the consensus committee had voted. We agreed on it. The final book was ready. And so there has to be an opportunity to file appeals. And so the ICC code policy has 2 kind of rounds or types of, claims you can make, right? So there's the appeals, and then there's something called preemption. So they're very distinct things. And so the preemption claims, so they set out, I think a call for, the appeals and the preemption, all this stuff is open for comment or open for feedback. And so they hear on the preemption from an organization that they feel some of the code changes violate preemption. And now I am not an expert on preemption. What I've learned along the way is preemption has kind of 2 components of it. One is that you can't limit a certain product. You can't have a code change that limits a certain product, like gas equipment. I think the other aspect of it is that you cannot require in the main body of the code a requirement to exceed the efficiency standards, the federal efficiency standards for HVAC equipment and hot water equipment. So those are regulated by a federal standard. The code itself cannot say exceed that. And so there was a proposal in the 2021 ICC that did that, for water heating equipment. Pick from these 5 things, but those 5 things exceeded the federal standards. And so that was removed based on this concept of preemption.
Okay.
And so when you're asking about that point system, I think the point system is a way to claim savings for things that you can't mandate, right? So you can't mandate to go above, but you can offer options as long as there's enough options there that do not require above code equipment or hot water, right? So that points table is very long because it has enough points for people to use without relying on high performance gas equipment. But I think we all know in our work that we're not getting to zero if we don't have high performance equipment, right? So it was a very clever way to move us forward. So the preemption, the claims came in, and so they said that all electric appendix violated that rule, right? Because it's limiting gas, right? A gas product cannot be prohibited from being used in new construction. So they filed that claim. They also filed claims on a stretch code appendix that I had proposed, saying that in certain climate zones, the point requirement in my stretch code appendix went up to 20 instead of from 10. And they said that, in these hot climate zones, if, under very limited scenarios where ground source heat pumps and solar was not possible for a home, then they would have to use high performance equipment, and therefore it violated preemption. So those claims came in, I think, in January of this year. And then at the same time, we're hearing the appeals, right? So the appeals get filed. I think there ended up being 9 appeals filed. Now, in the standards development process, appeals have to be limited to procedure or process violations. You cannot use an appeal, or you're not supposed to use an appeal, to relitigate things that you object to technically. But every standard I've ever seen is somebody files an appeal because they don't agree with it on a technical level, right? So they've lost the battle on technical, right?
Because on philosophical or
sure,
whatever, yeah.
But the point is, you're supposed to have that technical debate about the technical merits of a proposal in those consensus committee meetings that are open to the public, interested parties, stakeholders. Everybody gets to weigh in, and then the consensus committees use that input, both for and against the proposal, and makes a decision, right? So you hear about it at a technical level at that point. So this process is just to say, were there procedural violations, in developing, the code book. And so in the 2021 ICC, they had decided, the board of directors said, if something's not in the scope and intent, it does amount to a procedural violation. And so the appellants this round, again, revisited all those readiness proposals and said, these are again outside scope and intent. Even though the intent's been rewritten, these are outside the scope and intent of the energy code and shouldn't have been approved by the consensus committee. And so they claimed, based on,
to an appeals board, and they
to an appeals board.
Okay, so they claimed this to an appeals board.
So the whole process is you submit the appeals in writing. An appeals board, 4-person appeals board is convened, and I think that was the same in 2021. So this appeals board is made up of ICC members. I believe the chair is a member of the board of directors. So the 4-person appeals board held 3 days of hearings at the end of February, where the appellants, who filed these appeals based on scope and intent and other things, but mostly about scope and intent, made their case. The people that are in support of the appeals could speak. People who were in opposition to the appeals had the opportunity to speak and submit documents. During that appeals board, ICC staff spoke against the appeals. Like, they had a document saying that, the appeals being filed do not violate scope and intent. So this is the same ICC staff that has supported our committees for the past couple of years. So we felt confident after the appeals board that, this isn't a violation of scope and intent. The appeals board made a ruling, right? The report got published and it said, we found no procedural irregularities. And so their recommendation, because the next step is for the board of directors to make a decision. And so in their report, they just said, with respect to each of the 9 appeals, the appeals board finds that the appellants have not demonstrated a material and significant irregularity of process or procedure, and therefore recommends the ICC Board of Directors deny each appeal. Okay? So that's from their own appeals board. Deny each appeal. So the Board of Directors still has the final say. So this is, I think, an 18-person board. And so they hold a hearing of their own on March 18th, where, again, the appellants get to speak, ICC staff gets to speak, and now there's not as much time for supporters of the appeals and opposition of the appeals to speak. So the outcome of that hearing is that they did not agree with their own appeals board. And so they actually voted to side with the appellants. And so they actually agreed with the appellants that...
Who were the gas
There's a couple.
industry?
No, there was a couple. So the appellants were the American Gas Association, the American Public Gas Association, but then also BOMA and the National Multifamily Housing Council, as well as a group of code officials from Region 6, which is where we live in the Northeast. So, but basically, when they reviewed all the appeals, they saw that some of them had a lot of overlap. And so they kind of grouped them under these themes of scope and intent.
Gotcha.
And so that's really, when it comes down to it, the Board of Directors, when they released their report, the reason that they sided with the appeals were, again, based on scope and intent. So they, again, agreed very similar to 2021 IECC, even though they spent a long time, and I assume a lot of effort, to revise the intent statement. Here we were at the same place where the Board of Directors is saying these readiness proposals, and there was actually another proposal for demand response water heating. These proposals in the intent statement that we wrote are not part of the intent of the energy code and will be not removed. So in 2021, it just got flat out removed. So this time they get moved to an appendix.
So we're talking about EV readiness, some electric appliance readiness, demand response, and solar readiness.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. So this is that rinse and repeat. Like, why are we doing the same thing? So literally that EV readiness and that electric readiness proposal that had been approved in 2021 based on the online vote, appeals were filed. They were determined by the board to not be in the intent statement. They get fully removed. Now, we basically have very similar proposals on EV charging and electric readiness. You add the solar readiness, you add the demand response water heating. And again, the Board of Directors is saying that wasn't part of our intent. These do not belong in the main body based on the intent statement that we wrote. And so they move it to an appendix. And this is a report that just came out March 20th. So just a few weeks ago, based on us recording this on April 2nd. And so in terms of preemption, right? So the preemption ruling from the Board of Directors was also that that all electric appendix, they deemed that there was a case of preemption. So they did not want it to be published. So even though it was an optional appendix in the book, that wasn't a mandate, it was just there for jurisdictions that wanted to take that step, they decided to move it completely out of the book. For my stretch code appendix, they decided it could stay, but they were adding a disclaimer to the top to say, in climate zone 0, 1, 2, and 3, there's a chance, a preemption concern could be raised on the stretch code appendix, but at least that appendix stays in the book.
Okay, so that's the end result. That's what's going to get published. Is it a done deal?
It is a done deal.
Okay. So quite an arduous process.
Oh, yeah. In theory, again, the thought was you get a group of people with diverse perspectives, you give them the authority to decide what goes in the main body of the code, what goes in an appendix, you set them on this path. There's definitely language throughout ICC's website about getting to zero, right? 2030 goals, 2050 goals, help our communities confront climate change. The only reason I applied to be on the committee was because I thought this was the actual vision. Come in 2024, take everything I've learned from Stephen Winter Associates about high performance buildings. We've steadily worked to get buildings to net zero. Let's get that into the energy code, right? So we have 3 steps to get there: the 24, the 27, and then the 2030. So I think
the 2030, and that's an ICC kind of mandate that
Not a mandate, you know,
or
it's
a
just
goal?
in their, who knows at this point, right? It's all
mission
vague.
statement?
The way I read their language on their website is like, this is something that they were pushing for. And this is, you know, when you look at you every year you want to get 10% more savings, you're never going to get to zero, right? P&L does a nice chart about the codes as they steadily improve in performance. There's no way to get to zero unless you have some kind of mandate. So I think a lot of us were under this assumption that, yeah, this is a 3-step process. We're going to create a net zero energy code 2030. So maybe we were under false guidance. Maybe we read it wrong, but that was the reason, you know, why keep pushing forward? Like why, how is ICC, the model code, if the model code is not going to get us there, why is it the model code, right? Jurisdictions adopt this energy code because it's supposed to be the model code. If it's never going to be the code that gets you to zero, then it seems like other codes and standards should be the ones.
So, well, it's obviously frustrating. I know you are very discouraged and have been very frustrated by this. I mean, especially since the whole where do things belong in the main body of the code or in the appendix, you got guidance from ICC staff that you decide where it goes, and then the board basically reversed that and said, no, we decide, and we think you put it in the wrong place. I mean, I'm going to not talk about big questions about is electrification a really viable path to zero carbon emissions or dramatic reductions in carbon emissions in the near term. That's a different podcast. Maybe we'll link to the roundtable podcast we had last summer where we talked about code complexity and viability. But this process, I mean, what comes next? Or do you know what comes next? 2027 is the next code cycle. Do you have any feelings? Do you have any inclination? Do you have any hope for dramatic changes?
I have a lot of feelings.
IECC?
I have a lot of feelings. It is 100% up to the board of directors what happens next. They own the intent statement. They wrote it. My feeling is this is a failure in leadership. They were asked for specific guidance from these consensus committees in a brand new process that they were starting. They were asked for, the committees asked for clear guidance, and they just neglected to give it to us. So I think it's wholly on them to figure out how to change. They have options to clarify their policies before the 2027 cycles start. So the 2027, like the IRC, IMC, IBC, they're in two kind of groups. So there's a group A and a group B. So one group of books are going to start their code hearing process next week. Another group of the books will start
this is April
in January
2024. Yeah.
So in January 2025, another set of books will start. And this energy code, if we wanted to follow the same exact timeline as we did to produce the 2024, the call for proposals would happen this fall. So they basically have a few months right now to revise the intent statement with crystal clear language that cannot possibly be interpreted incorrectly for the third time in a row. It is completely within their capabilities as a board to write this clearly, get input from a wide group of stakeholders, and just itemize it very crystal clear. So they have that option. And so once they do that, I mean, they had to convene a new committee if they're going to keep with this standards development process. Our terms all end in June. So they'll have to open the application. And so I think if they do not provide clear guidance on what can be in the book and can't, and if they're not willing to provide interpretations during the development process, because who knows what's going to come up, right? So embodied carbon, that was a subcommittee we had formed, but we actually didn't have a proposal come to us that addressed embodied carbon. So that is another big ticket item. Which code book has it? Which scope and intent of which book? Where does this belong? Where does embodied carbon belong? And there's mixed opinions. Does it belong in the IRC and the IBC? Does it belong in the energy code? Can it be in both? They have to make this decision now before those proposals, the calls for proposals for the energy code and the IRC happen later this fall. So it's really up to them. I think what happens from here is completely up to the board of directors, change policies, change the intent. make sure they get feedback from folks, and then during the process, provide leadership, provide input when it's asked of them. Don't let people fail for the third time in a row for the same reason. And if they don't want to be a leadership body, right? If they say like, if they can't mandate electrification, even as an appendix, right? So don't give false hope that this is the leadership standard, this is a model code. If they want people to look for those kind of measures elsewhere, I mean, this is the model code, right? So just be transparent that there's other codes, standards, books that jurisdictions need to adopt, and it's no longer the IECC. They need to look elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, California has always done their own thing on energy codes. They led the way, and I think IECC kind of, in many ways, was catching up with California for a while. But we're seeing more people, states and cities, considering different or at least dramatic additional requirements that are more focused on climate concerns. Because it's and you hear this from a lot of people that it's the energy conservation code. Gas or electricity, they're both energy. Switching fuels doesn't belong in the energy conservation code. Okay, well then you're going to see more and more people who really want to take a stand against climate concerns, bailing on the IECC and finding different means, different measures, different requirements.
Exactly.
Personally, as you know, I am skeptical that mandating electrification in the short term would have net positive climate impacts. I'm a huge proponent of it. New homes, especially new single-family homes, all electric done right is so sensible and so works so well on every front, climate-wise, operating costs, first cost, yada yada yada. But very, very often it's not done right, and refrigerant leakage and et cetera, can lead to really dramatic climate impacts. I don't know. That's just my concern. Is that a reason not to push that? I don't know. The EV readiness really surprises me. I mean, because that does seem like a no-brainer. All right, if there's an understanding that electric appliances is really a very, very likely way to mitigate climate concerns, a few $100 to prepare homes when they're being built versus thousands of dollars to retrofit it down the road, it seems kind of like a no-brainer in my mind. But again, it's not energy conservation. It's paving the way for versatility for more climate-sensitive homes down the road, I guess. I don't know. It's not an easy answer. But is it fair to say that you are not the only one on the committee who is very discouraged and frustrated by what has happened?
I would say I'm not the only one. There's definitely a large group of people that feel this way. We definitely have 2 voting members that were appellants. So the rest of us, I think what gets mischaracterized about our feelings of disappointment are that we're sore losers, right? We're complaining about the outcome because we're sore losers. And so what I try to tell people is that this is not about losing. I mean, I had tons of proposals. Let's not say tons. I had a handful of proposals that did not reach the 2/3, right? I was pretty good and diligent about getting input about how to get to consensus. I'm not complaining about any of those not making it into the code, right? So that's a sore loser if you can't win your argument based on your technical basis, right? What we're upset about is that we asked for guidance, right? All of this could be avoided. So I think the point is we're upset, and the large group of voting members that are upset is because we were told it was within our wheelhouse to make these decisions. We made all our decisions based on that, and that was changed at the very end. So it's all avoidable. So I think the disappointment, the frustration is that this was all avoidable, and it was all the same thing that happened last time. Yeah. So it's not even like, that fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? It's like, why did we fall for this again? Like, why did this happen again? Why did this in the same exact way for the same proposals, right? That's just wild. Who would have thought we would be doing the same thing 3 years later? And we're just running out of time, it's just wild.
Okay. I'm going to wrap up. Usually we wrap up with the question, what are we going to talk about 5 years down the road? I am not going to ask you that question because I know what your answer is based on everything you said at the last hour. But if we can end on a high note, like, can you highlight maybe some silver linings from this process so that people don't feel as frustrated as you as they turn off this podcast? I mean, are there any within the code process or even outside the code process where, the ICC is heading in the right direction, or other groups heading in the right direction, really kind of making some positive changes?
I mean, there are some good, like we talked about them before, but there are some good changes in the 2024 ICC. And if PNL's math was right, it is 6 to 7% more efficient than the 2021. And like I said, the 2021 was substantially more efficient than the previous. So what a lot of people say is, if this code book gets adopted, right? So there's a lot of states that aren't even close to adopting the 2021 or the 2018. So I think the silver lining is, will they find the flexibility in the 2024 interesting enough that they would skip the 2021 and go straight to 2024? All these states that are like back in the 09s, 12s, 15s, like really old energy codes, right? If we could get them to adopt the 2024 instead of the 2021, that would be a silver lining.
Awesome. Thank you. I say we leave it there.
That's a good idea.
All right. Thanks to Gayathri. Gayathri provided a lot of links and reference material that we have in the show notes for folks who really want to dig into this topic. That's at swinter.com/podcast, swinter.com/podcast. I'll mention again the roundtable episode we did last summer, July of 2023, answering tough questions about energy codes, where we talk more philosophically about what codes can and should and might be able to do. Buildings and Beyond is produced by Stephen Winter Associates. We are focused on making buildings better. New buildings, old buildings, making them more efficient, more healthy, more accessible, sustainable, durable, just better. Check us out at swinter.com. Check out our careers page. We have many opportunities. We have offices in Boston, Connecticut, New York, and Washington, D.C. Thanks to the podcast team here, Ian Slackus and Dylan Martello, for the editing and pulling together the audio, Trisha Carr, Heather Breslin, Kelly Westby. And thank you for listening.